this novel is so wonderful. I mean, I can't reel out all the awards that it has won, but I can tell you that she is a recipient of many fellowships, including the Yado, the Virginia Center for Creative Arts, and the Emily Harvey Foundation. She's at work on her second novel, but it's at the instance of her first novel that she's here. And just to dwell a bit more on the novel, it opens in 1974 during the last day of Emperor Selassie's congestive cardiac failure, which, as a doctor, I know what that is. I don't know if you do. On my left is Vamba Sharif, a Liberian who was born in Kolahun, in 1973. He spent his early teen years in Kuwait, where he completed his secondary school education, but he left because of the first Gulf War, and first to Damascus in Syria, and then moved to the Netherlands, where he studied law. But I don't think he's been wearing any wigs these days. He's been busy at work at novels. He's the author of 5 novels, and one of his novels that has been translated by himself to English is the novel we'll be discussing. Can we have a round of applause for him? So the novel we'll be discussing is called Bound to Secrecy. It's an African crime detective novel, and that just gets me excited, because it's not often that you hear of that, that African crime detective, and it closely follows William Mawolo, a sleuth of sorts, an unlikely sleuth. I mean, think of a James Bond with a limp who arrives in a small Liberian town with a secret mission to investigate the mysterious disappearance of a police chief. This novel has been it was described by a critic, and I found it very interesting. As the critic says, he succeeds in letting an African detective fail in an African way, and both the story and the failure are grandiose. I find that very intimidating. I'm here to write my own novel. So, without further ado, we'll just take short readings from both authors. This is our first time. So you can clap for us as well.
Thank you. Those of you that were here the first time, you'll pretend like you've never heard this before. I'm going to be reading a section of my novel where one of my characters named Mickey, who has become involved, he's a low-level soldier at this time, working with the military regime that is in the process of overthrowing Emperor Haile Selassie and creating their own rule that will become a dictatorship. Mickey has been sent by this regime into one of the areas in Ethiopia that was struck by famine. The regime has told him to take a report and bring it back to them. They will use that report to create more evidence about why Haile Selassie should be overthrown. He's writing, he's in this village right now, and he's writing a letter to his friend, a childhood friend, Dawit, who has become involved in in a resistance group that also wants Haile Selassie gone. Eventually, they are at this point on the same side. Both the resistance groups and the government and this military regime want Haile Selassie out. But eventually, Dawit and Mickey will find themselves on completely opposite sides. But at the moment, Mickey is writing a letter to Dawit. This is how a man tills his land, behind cattle that are tied to one end of a plow that he uses to dig and lift and turn the ground. He holds a stick in one hand and the end of the plow in the other. At the end of that stick is a rope that he uses to whip the animals when they tire from the hot sun and the lack of water and simple hunger. A man works like this every day, every month, year after year, behind his cattle, his hand attached to a plow that has dug its own imprints into his calloused palms. He speaks to no one but himself. He hears nothing but his own slavish grunts as he pushes his plow into dirt, willing a crop to grow from unforgiving ground, praying daily for more rain. But it didn't rain in 1972 in the north, my friend, and the farmer had no crops. The rains did not come as they should, and when the rains failed, the crops failed. And when the crops failed, the farmer grew hungry. And when he grew hungry, his cattle also grew hungry, because a farmer will feed his cattle before himself. When the cattle began to die, the farmer gathered his family and tried to walk to the nearest village, the nearest aid shelter, the nearest anywhere where he could hold out his proud hand and beg for food. But everywhere he went was the same as what he had left. They are starving here in Wallo, Dawit. They are starving in Tigray and Shoa. We have lived in the city and we have forgotten about these people. And imagine now a farmer far from Wallo in the south, where the rains are more forgiving and the land has not been cursed by famine. This farmer grows land that isn't his. This farmer plows land that isn't his, that was never his father's, which was never his grandfather's, and will never be his son's. He works as hard as his animals day after day to pay a landowner's taxes and to glean enough crops so his family has enough grains for food after they've given the landowner his share. The landowner's share is always large. It is always more than the landowner needs. It is a selfish share created by a selfish system that preys on the weak and makes them servants to the rich. Dawit, we live in a feudal system. Our country exploits those who work the hardest to stay alive. Our emperor has built the myth of this land on the blood of those who have been too tired to voice their own truths. Is this my country? We have grown up together, Dawit, but I was someone else before you knew me. My father was this farmer from the south. He died on a rich man's plot of land, tied to the wrong end of his plow because he'd been forced to sell his cattle to feed his family. My father died like an animal, still tied to those ropes when I found him, swallowing with his last breaths the dust of another man's land, broken by the burden of his labor. The rich think this land is theirs, Dawit, though they have never earned the right to call it theirs, not like these farmers, not like my father. Most of those who are here on the ground dying are the ones who were strong enough to walk out of their villages. The roads are littered with our people who have died on the way, their bodies rotting in the sun if the vultures haven't gotten to them. We dishonor our dead and our workers, Dawit. The rich have kept this secret. The emperor has stolen this truth from us, and we have to fight to get our country back and save these people. A man told me as many as 200,000 will die. They will die. It is too late for them. Do we even have as many alive in Addis Ababa? Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to read from chapter 2 of my novel, The Bound to Secrecy. It is a fragment in which the main protagonist, William Marwolo, meets an old man. The men teased each other about their passion for palm wine, but with the fourth and last gourd, the drinking took on a solemn aspect. The two began to appraise each other anew, each bent on making the other drunk. The stranger refilled the calabash, but instead of drinking, he leaned towards the old man as though to bow to him, to honor him as befitted a man of his age. The old man, who could not decline the honor, emptied the calabash in one swallow, refilled it, and handed it over to the stranger. The wine was strong. The old man knew this, for it had been tapped from one of the best palm trees in Wolagizi. The stranger emptied the calabash. His eyes, the old man noticed, had already glazed over, and his tongue swept across the corners of his lips, lapping up the froth. And then he broke into a laughter filled with the mystery of drunkenness. He keeled over, his whole body rocking to it. It was time, the old man thought, to pose his question, and he did so casually. You said you were sent to Wolagizi? The stranger sat up, poured some wine into the calabash, his hands trembling, visibly drunk now, but he gulped it all down. No, he slurred, I'm just passing through. Then he passed the calabash to the old man, who took a sip and handed it back to him, amazed by his unusual resistance to the wine. What was your name again? He asked. William Soko Mawolo. The stranger answered curtly, his voice crisp, as if he had not had a single drop of wine. The name baffled the old man. Though it sounded familiar, there was also something obscure about it, especially the middle name, which was unfamiliar to him. The stranger was of imposing height, his skin so dark that his forehead glinted blue. He was much unlike the people of that forest region, whose skin color was less suited than his own. The old man concluded that he was indeed a stranger, a foreigner, perhaps from beyond the borders. But on the other hand, he spoke like them, drank palm wine with the same passion. Mine is Okapu, the old man said. However, everyone in Wolagizi calls me Okapu, and I recommend you to do the same, Mr. Mawolo. I certainly will, William replied, and turned his attention to the wine as if he was noticing it for the first time. What do you do all day, Okapu? I don't want to bore you with the story of my work, Mr. Mawolo. Suffice to say that it is very unrewarding. Then why do you do it? Okapu did not answer, but instead leaned back on the collapsible chair, and then in a slow, calculated voice said, You look like a government minister to me, Mr. Mawolo. Far from it. I work for myself, Okapu. Thank you.
I don't know if I should apologize that we come after lunch, so it seems like our voices are lulling you all into sweet sleep. I would beg that people should sit up. It's going to be engaging. So I have a couple of questions. Some are general for both of you, and then some are specific. But I'll start with the general questions. A wise man said that writing was very easy, that all you needed to do was just look for a white piece of paper, look for a blade, cut yourself, and bleed into the paper. Someone else once said something about how for a writing to be good and for a reader to enjoy it, the writer must suffer. So I'm going to ask both of you, how's the suffering process for especially these novels that you have for us here? Okay, Vamba?
Oh, yes. For me, this suffering process was real in many ways because not only with Bounty Secrecy, but with the Land of the Fathers. But Bounty Secrecy, I wrote it in a year, I think, in a span of a year. So it was very easy to write a book. But I had an experience that really inspired it. And in 2000, during the war in Liberia, when my first novel, The Land of the Fathers, was published, a Dutch television crew program approached me and asked me if I was willing to go with them to Liberia to make a documentary about my homecoming, because my first novel had become a bestseller in Holland, and it changed my life. And I was receiving these fan mails, and people were inviting me into their lives, and so I was the darling of the critics, and I was honored. I felt if someone wants to pay my way to go home, why not? So I went with them to Monrovia. Monrovia was at peace during that time. There was an interim government led by Charles Taylor. That is a man who was later sentenced, and he's now in prison in England, I think. But what I didn't know when we got to Liberia was that the journalists had a hidden agenda. Actually, they wanted to meet Charles Taylor through me. And so it was not only about a film about a writer going home, but a film about meeting Charles Taylor. And that became clear to me when we got to Liberia. And I was very reluctant. I didn't want to see Charles Taylor, because this is a man who had killed thousands and thousands of Liberians. And his speeches were mixed with hatred and violence. And I didn't want to meet him at all. And my father, who was in Liberia at that time, didn't want to meet Charles Taylor at all. And but finally, an uncle of mine agreed to arrange our meeting with Charles Taylor. And we met him, and the meeting coincided with Charles Taylor organizing a meeting with some elders from northern Liberia, where I came from, where I was born, some old ministers, and very important people of the North. And why he was doing that was because he wanted those people to declare their support for him in his war against the North, which means the people had to declare their support for him in his war against their children. And what happened was quite remarkable, because I saw people whom I knew from childhood, and who didn't know me because I spent most of my life outside of Liberia, standing up and praising Charles Taylor and declaring their support for him in his war against the North. So I saw the display of power, and I saw fear, the consequence of power. And since then, I began to think of this relationship between power and fear, and the fear it generates. So I wanted to write a novel in which the main theme of the novel will be power and fear. And I was wondering how to write about the novel. Should I write and mention Charles Taylor, and mention the people whom I met? Finally, I read the novel My Name is Red by Orhan Pamuk, and I thought, yes, this is how I should go about it. It should be a detective novel, a crime novel, because if people who have read it, I mean, it's one of the most beautiful novels ever written, My Name is Red. So I said to myself, if Orhan Pamuk can do it, perhaps if I do my best, I can succeed. Yes, and so I decided to choose this format, a stranger returning, going to a place, and with a mission to investigate the disappearance of a very important person. And that's the genesis of the novel. That's the idea behind the novel. And yes, I succeeded. And the novel was ignored in the first, I think there were 3 reviews. And they were not that well. There was not really raving reviews, but something remarkable happened when it was published some years later. I received an email from a Belgian reader. He was a professor of literature at the University of Brussels, and he told me he had read Bound to Secrecy in Dutch, and he thought it was a wonderful novel So he wanted to translate it into French. And I was so very happy because I'd written this novel. It's been 5 years. I'd forgotten all about it. I was writing something else. And then someone came forward to really, and saw what I saw when I finished this novel, the importance of it. And then he translated it and sent it to 5 French publishers, and 3 of them wanted it. And Edition Metelier gave me an advance of 10,000 euros and, and published it. And then, the German wanted it, the Spanish, and then it's been going on ever since. So, once you've done your best, because Boris Pasternak his father once told him, be honest in your work, and your enemies will never defeat you. And that's very important for us writers, to be very honest, to do your best, and to go forward, to have the courage to go forward. Because I'd forgotten about this novel. It's been written years ago. It was not successful in Holland. And all of a sudden, I was getting all this attention all over the world. Okay. That's the story.
Thank you very much. Maza is going to tell us about our own suffering process now. Writing, or did you suffer at all? Or you didn't suffer?
No, it was... it's a really difficult thing to write a novel that is centered... to write a novel that is centered around... a revolution in your country, and I knew that once I decided to really go into to begin the book, to begin the writing process of the book centered on my own memories of the revolution, I knew immediately that the stakes were going to be very high for this book, and that it would not be an easy book because I was so invested in it. I wanted to, there were several things. I wanted to be as accurate as I could be with the human cost of conflict and the human cost of a revolution. And I decided that the only way that I could really do that was to make my character a doctor. Because a doctor is confronted with the physical remains of war. And I needed to follow him through the course of the book. And once I had set that, then I knew that I had to be prepared to go where the book was going to go, where he would take me. So it was very difficult to do that. I did not think it would be so hard, even though I was prepared. I didn't think it would be that hard. My assumption was that because there were so many years and so many thousands of kilometers that had distanced me from the revolution. I began writing the book when I lived in New York. It wouldn't be so hard to go back to that time, but I was completely wrong. The thing about imagination, and I think we'll probably get into this later, is that imagination is absolutely intertwined with memory and experience, that you cannot separate the two. And it's memory and lived experience that informs a writer's work or an artist's work. And as much as a writer might like to step out of that, it's impossible, I think. So,
I think amongst the questions I was going to ask was what you once, you said in an interview that you said imagination is our savior.
Yes.
And it brought to mind what E.L. Doctorow, the American writer who just passed, said. He said that there was no such thing as imagination, that there was only memory. And I felt that you would respond to that in a way.
Yeah.
And in a way, I do think that both books are really about imagination.
Yes.
His is about imagination as reliving, and yours is about re-experiencing.
Yeah.
And I do think, again, that you should talk a bit more about one of the characters who is, well, maybe he's on the fringe of the novel, but he has a powerful influence, the Emperor Selassie, who is, well, according to the Rastafari tradition, religion, is quite important to that. So I don't know what, as an Ethiopian who was born during his reign, who lived maybe through part of it, or at least have stories of his legend.
Yes.
What do you have to say about the myth about him?
The myth of Haile Selassie was partly created by him, partly also created by his people, but also created by the West. And I think for me to, I wrote several drafts of this book, of the novel, and writing around him until at some point there was a negative space that was there. And I said, I can't write this novel about a revolution that was started to get him out of power if he's not part of the book. He has to be part of it. But I wasn't sure how to, I had no interest in writing about a ruler. I had no interest in writing about Haile Selassie as a legend and as a myth. I have no interest in characters like that. They're not complicated the way that human beings are. I wanted to know who this man was when he took off his uniforms and when he's sitting down with his family and when he is reprimanding his son or when he is arguing with his wife. Who is that man? Because those are who our rulers are. They are human beings. And I was starting to go through old documents and old photographs of Haile Selassie during the end of his reign. And I came across one photo, and it was the last photograph taken of him alive. By this point, he has been put under house arrest. The dictator, Mengistu, has full control of who will visit him, how long. His children, or if anyone wants to visit him, they have to ask the dictator for permission first. So you can imagine this man's life being completely ruled by his enemy. At this point that the photograph was taken, Haile Selassie has seen his nephew executed. All of his top ministers have been executed. His grandchildren, his granddaughters, his daughters are in prison. Most of the people he knows have been imprisoned or they have been killed. And if you are the emperor, you know that your time is coming. You know that they will probably not let you live. And I wondered what that's like. What does that feel like for a man who's 80 years old to be, what do you think about when you're completely alone in your room? And this photograph was of him sitting at his desk, and he has his hands like this on the desk. He has his hands in his head. He's very short, so his legs are not quite touching the ground. And it's an image of complete isolation and for me, complete vulnerability. And I said, you know, I can do that man. I can do an 80-year-old lonely man who is wondering every time the door opens if that will be the end.
Oh, wow. This is very interesting. Your novel was very successful, and before I come to Van Vamba, and it's a first novel. I remember reading something that Richard Yates once said, that he had the misfortune of having written his best novel first. I don't know, do you have such anxieties? I mean, I know you have a new work in progress, maybe you're almost published. How do you feel, I mean, about going on from proceeding from one book into the next? Do you have anxieties about the reception? Because here we have Vamba, whose book was almost a failed novel until something happened, you know. Some professor read it.
Yeah, I think, the second book, everyone says the second book is always the hardest because you think you have done everything by the first book and you think you know everything, and then you sit down for the second book and you realize, oh my God, I know nothing. I have to start all over again. But the thing that I realized is that this second book had to be something completely different from the first book. I didn't want to repeat myself. I don't want to do what worked in the first book. I needed to continue to stretch myself. And if the first book terrified me, which it did, the second book should be equally, if not more, terrifying, because I now have more skills, which means I need to do more. And this second book is very, very different. The books that I have been reading are very different from the books that I was reading when I was writing the first book. And I think that I'm now in this process of completely radical and drastic revisions, and I'm no longer afraid to cut out whole hundreds of pages to get 2 or 3 good ones that I know that is the kind of writing I would like to do for the second one.
Really, really, very nice. Now to Vamba. I'm interested in your novels. You've written both historical novels and you've chosen to write just one crime novel. So on the continent, I don't think crime writing, especially at the level you're writing it, because your novel, it's not so much about a plot-driven crime novel. It's about language. You care so much about languages.
Many of you here. A writer, an author in his own right. His book, The Accidental Public Servant, gives us an insight into the workings of government at the highest level. A round of applause for our guests, please. Now, I want to share a bit of information with you before we get into the conversation. And the way I want to structure it again is 20 minutes of talking to our 2 guests, and then we open it up so that we make it as interactive as possible. At the moment, about 1 million Chinese people live in Africa. There's been an increase in trade 20-fold between Africa and China in the last 10 years. The numbers that I have, and I mean they're not completely 100% because there's a bit of secrecy when it comes to numbers, dealing with the way China does business in Africa. But the numbers that I have is something like $160 billion per annum in trade between Africa and the continent, and that China has an estimated $2.9 billion investment in Africa. Now, what Professor Howard did was basically to examine Chinese people in Africa with a view to understanding how they're trading, what they're doing, and what the impact is on Africa, and whether, essentially, he seeks to give you information to decide whether this is a good relationship, a bad relationship, or a relationship that can be improved. And so, without saying too much, I'd like to start by asking him to tell us in a nutshell, what in your view is the difference between the Chinese approach to Africa to the Western approach to Africa?
Thank you very much, Kadaria. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. I've done a tremendous amount of speaking about this book, which came out 1.5 years ago, but unfortunately, not so much of it has been in Africa. And at this festival, we have all deplored in various panels the difficulties of distributing literature, books, and even information among the Balkanized countries of the continent. And so even as a publisher publishing with a large, powerful publishing house in America, it's a constraint one also feels in that sort of situation. Your question is, how is the Chinese relationship different from the Western relationship? Well, the Western relationship grows out of a history of imperialism and colonialism, and then what many people would style as a kind of neo-colonialism that followed upon independence. The Chinese had a 15th century encounter with Africa that was very brief and episodic, and then were not present in the life of the continent for a very long time. Came back into contact intensively with the continent in the 1960s and 70s in the revolutionary period under Mao, and then disappeared again. And so the period of contact that I'm looking at in my book and in other pieces of work that I've done is really warm engagement that China has launched with the continent starting at the end of the 1970s, the beginning of the 1980s. China decided that early in its reform period that receiving inward investment from rich Western capitalist countries could provide a quick boost to its economy, but really couldn't carry the country forward in the long term. And that in order to do so, it had to inject its own energies outward around the world and become a globalizer in its own right, on its own terms. And as early as the late 1980s, China identified Africa as a priority zone for this activity. And the reason it did so was because it saw, well, a number of important factors. Africa's extraordinary demographics, meaning it was already well understood back that far that Africa would begin a huge spurt of growth that would last a century in terms of the overall demographics of the continent. And of course, Nigeria occupies a very special place in that conversation. African urbanization, but then also the lack of intense Western commercial and investment engagement with Africa in the 1980s. And so China said, here's an open space with terrific demographics where the competition won't be too terribly tough.
It's all opportunities, that's what you're
saying. It's pure opportunism.
Right. Now, Mr. Governor, what is your view of the Chinese presence in Africa?
I think China's presence in Africa is what we ultimately make it as African nations. I think on the whole, from what I've seen in the last 20 years, it has been positive. The engagement is far more honest and more transparent than the engagement we've had with the West. Today, China is investing in infrastructure in Africa, which is a key thing that we need. They are causing problems of deindustrialization with dumping. That is a negative. But as I said, on the whole, I think what we need to do as African nations is to think very deeply about how we engage with China so that we get the best out of that engagement in the long term. As Africans, I foresee an opportunity because Chinese wages have been rising. They are near $600 a month now, and they will soon have to start moving their factories out of China. And I think the natural place for them to locate is Africa. And the way and manner we engage with the Chinese, attracting investment, getting low interest loans, and moving those factories without moving millions of Chinese to Africa is a challenge for our political leaders.
Now, if I could ask Howard to come in here, based on the work that you've done and you know, the findings of which are in this book, I've read it, many people here might have not, do you find evidence that African governments and African policy leaders are actively thinking about this relationship in the way that the governor has said we need to think about it?
No, I don't. I agree with much of the spirit of what Governor El-Rufai has just said, but the thing that happened that I described going back to the 1980s, so the Chinese show up late 1980s, early 1990s. Africa had just been through this long period of economic adjustment that was imposed by the World Bank and IMF, et cetera, and then the end of the Cold War. The Western so-called traditional partners of Africa turned their attentions to Eastern Europe and to other parts of the world. And so I often give speeches or talks at college campuses, and I liken this to the student who goes for a whole semester and you haven't had a date, or you've gone the whole year and you haven't had a date, and someone calls you and says, "Are you busy Friday?" And you're too excited to reason the thing through very carefully. And so the Africans, when the Chinese called, were in that state. And they had a response of irrational exuberance, where they just said, "Oh, don't mind the details, where do we sign?" And they began signing contracts with the Chinese, which are still being executed today. And there's been a lag time, really, of 10 to 15 years, in which it has taken, during which time Africans have taken their time really coming to terms with what this all means and how to guarantee their own best interests are obtained in these sorts of engagements. Not that the Chinese are intrinsically good or bad. It's about finding the right way to engage with them.
And Mr. Governor, as someone who's operating at the highest level of government, and you've done so in the past, you've dealt, I think, with the Chinese first as FCT minister, and maybe now, I don't know if Kaduna State is talking to them. What are the sort of policies that you're beginning to put in place, or indeed do we actually have any policy? Because in the past we've seen a situation where Nigeria is not really prepared properly for engagement, not just with the Chinese but with other foreign powers, where the interest of the nation is paramount. Is this going to change?
Okay, well, first let me qualify your question with a statement. I will not say I've operated at the very highest levels. I was Minister of Federal Capital Territory.
Yeah, okay.
That is not the highest level. That is a little 2 or 3 steps below the highest level. But I've had, at that time, I've had experience dealing with the Chinese regarding the Abuja Metro, for instance. I found that their prices were 1/3 of European prices. And they offer these prices with export credit, 85%, 50-year loans, 1% interest that none of the multilaterals or bilaterals can match. So we signed a contract with the Chinese, Exim, and CCECC to build the Abuja Metro line at incredibly competitive prices with export credit and so on and so forth. So for us, that deal was quite advantageous. But was there an overall framework for dealing with the Chinese? No, there wasn't in 2007. I don't know whether there is now. As you know, since 2007, I've been out, been in opposition. We just got back in. And I understand that the president of Nigeria is visiting China early next year, and work is being done to try to frame an engagement policy with the Chinese. I don't think we have one. And I think that is the key. As Professor French pointed out, the Chinese are neither good nor bad. Just like the Europeans and the Americans are neither good nor bad. It depends on what you're able to negotiate as the basis of engagement with them. And I think that if we don't think through how to engage with them in a way that is beneficial to us overall, we'll end up coming out worse off. Imperialism has many faces. The competition between nations is real, and each nation tries to get as much advantage in its relationship with others. So it's really up to us to stand up and figure out for ourselves how to engage with the Chinese. But clearly, the way the world economy is evolving, the reality that by 2025, the Chinese economy will be the #1 economy in the world, imposes on all of us in Africa, African political leaders, a duty to accept the reality that China and India will figure much more in global political economy than in the past, and that the West is going to take a second seat in this arena, and we have to prepare to engage with both in a way that is beneficial to our countries and our continent.
Now, in talking about the Western engagement with Africa in your book, Howard, you talked about a loss of influence, which you said, and I mean the bit that I found interesting in the book, you were talking about the American Aid Mission representative to Mali, Mr. John Johnson, and your words were that you saw American self-doubt, something that you're not accustomed to seeing in this part of the world. Given what the governor has said, how significant is the self-doubt that you found among, if you like, officials working for Western governments within Africa?
So the thing that's most striking is that, I talked about this period after the Cold War where Western interests headed off into other directions. What's most striking is that what has brought a modicum of Western interest back to Africa is this kind of haunting fear of losing Africa to China, which is an irrational fear. Western investment in Africa is still vastly larger than Chinese investment in Africa. Chinese trade has grown, of course, massively, but the West has tentacles, which you can take as a good word and a bad word, in Africa that run, over a century deep. The fact that we're sitting here in Nigeria speaking English at a book festival is one expression of these sorts of tentacles. The Chinese face massive handicaps themselves just competing with some of these invisible aspects of the Western engagement with Africa. So it's an irrational fear, really. From the African perspective, having a choice of suitors and being able to play suitors against each other and to seek different things from different suitors, where you see competitive advantages in one suitor versus another suitor is a good thing. And the unique thing, almost unique thing about Nigeria is that you have a scale in this country that allows, unlike almost any other, I mean, you look around West Africa. I was having lunch with a friend today, and we're talking about the size of Nigeria being an order of magnitude larger than its West African neighbors. So this is a rare African country where the sheer scale allows you to have a certain kind of conversation with your foreign partners, where once you begin to get your house in order, you can say to them, listen, we're happy to have you interested in coming here to do business with us, but we have our terms. Our terms are, you bring this, you bring that, you don't bring this or that other thing, and you like it or you don't like it. That's how we will do business. This, by the way, is how China opened up to the rest of the world, and it was able to do that because it had such a massive scale itself.
Now, your book is, in many ways, a collection of stories about individuals, both Chinese and African, and sort of how they're relating. And they're interesting characters which, you know, that give us an insight into the sort of Chinese thinking. I'm thinking here of the Mozambican businessman, whose strategy for building an economic empire in Africa is to get his son to impregnate local girls and give birth to as many, you know, half Chinese, half Mozambican. And I mean, he jumps out of the book because he's sort of, it seems almost, you know, like fiction. But these are the sort of people you found in talking about your book. Tell us a little bit about the sort of Chinese people that you came across in the course of writing this book.
So I met many Chinese people who had, men in particular, who had had children by African women in a variety of countries. But Hao was special, and this, I opened my book with this character because he settled upon Mozambique, first of all, with this notion that already by the time he came to Africa, there were Chinese people all over the place. And he figured Anglophone countries would be the place where Chinese were most common, because if Chinese speak a foreign language, English is the most obvious choice, right? So he chooses Mozambique. They speak Portuguese. He figures no Chinese people speak Portuguese. He arrives in Mozambique. There's Portuguese everywhere, even in the villages. And so he had initially imagined he was going to create a business in the capital, Maputo, but because there's so many Chinese there, he decides he's kind of turned off by that. He goes on a long search through the countryside, and he settles on this idea of acquiring land and growing various commercial crops. The problem is that in Mozambique, as in many African countries, you have to be a national of the country to own land. And so the only way he can overcome this that he comes up with is he can't acquire nationality himself, but through children, he can claim ownership. And so he calls for his two sons, a 15-year-old and maybe like a 12-year-old from China, to come join him. And he pushes them right away into, you know, coupling, basically. I mean, it was the most extraordinary thing. I'm watching this before my eyes, right? So Hao is an outlier in that sort of the details of his strategy, but I saw versions of this in many places.
Now, you know, this issue of land, because, I mean, often when we talk about China's engagement with Africa, a lot of people think we're talking about minerals mostly and natural resources. But from reading Howard's book, there's another big area of interest, and that is land, because increasingly food security is becoming a major issue. Again, you know, given that we are with a government that's looking to diversify and all of that, is the Chinese presence in Africa through agriculture something you would welcome? And if so, how would you seek to shape this engagement?
Personally, and I think amongst many of us governors, because we meet regularly in the Governors Forum and the Economic Council, we think that increased Chinese presence in Nigeria is overall going to be a positive thing for many, many reasons, some of which have been outlined by Professor French, because now we have choices, we have options. 20 years ago, if you wanted long-term loans, concessionary loans, you have only one window, more or less, the World Bank or the Africa Development Bank. They're all kind of Bretton Woods institutions in various guises. Today we have India, we have China, they have Exim banks and so on. So overall we think it's constructive. We must protect ourselves, and Africa has 60% of the world's arable land today. most arable land around the world is gone. We have less than 20% of the world's population right now, but we have 60% of the world's arable land. So going forward, we expect to see lots of Chinese and Middle Eastern interest in acquiring land for agriculture in Africa. Already, the Middle Eastern nations have been far ahead of the Chinese in that regard. But we have not seen a lot of Chinese wanting to acquire land in Nigeria so far, but we're aware that it's something that is going to happen. Land in Nigeria is vested. The ownership and control of land is vested in state governments. So we are having a conversation about what to do when that time comes. We realize that apart from minerals, one of the biggest assets we have in Nigeria is land. Because as I said, 60% of the world's arable land is in Africa, and 1/5 of that is in Nigeria. So we are a major, so to say, trustee of some of the largest piece of arable land in the whole world. And we think that's the next big thing. And we are having conversations on it. Indeed, the Economic Council has been talking about land reform in the last 3 months, and it's something that we're going to take seriously.
On an ideological level, are you happy to see the Chinese come and take over land, given that there's clarity that food security will become an issue in the future? Or is it something that, that you're not too comfortable with and you'd like to see, if you like, maybe a partnership of some sort, as opposed to just them taking over and cultivating?
The Land Use Act, which is part of the Nigerian Constitution, vests land in the governor of the state, and only Nigerian citizens can own land. Okay? So for the Chinese to have any land allocations in Nigeria, they have to incorporate a company in Nigeria that must pay Nigerian taxes by being a Nigerian citizen. So we are not too worried about that. What we hope to see is lots of investment that will create jobs, lead to agro-industrial economies, particularly in the northern parts of the country. We are not being ideological. We are looking for investment. We are looking for jobs. 80% of the population of most of the northern states is below the age of 35. We have a very young population, and most of our farmers are aging. Young people are not quite as interested in farming as they should be. So we welcome investments, whether it is from China or India or the Arabs or the Europeans. We welcome that. But as I said, the constitution, the control of land, and the fact that you have to be a Nigerian citizen, corporate or individual, to be able to acquire land in Nigeria, I think provides enough safeguards for us to extract maximum value from such investments.
If I could just interject something quickly. So I think the figure that the governor mentioned of 60% is actually 60% of unproductive arable land in the world. So arable land that is not being farmed presently in the world is in Africa. That's different from 60% of the world's arable land. But the other detail that I think is important to keep in mind is that if Africa is 20% of the world's population today, that's going to change very rapidly over the next 75 years. By the middle of this century, Africa will have twice as many people as it has today. And by the end of this century, although the projections vary because as you go further out in time, the margin of error increases. Africa will have, so it's 1.1 billion or so today. By the end of the century, between 3 and 5 billion people in Africa. Nigeria itself, the median estimate of the UN right now for Nigeria at the end of the century is about 1 billion people. Nigeria is the size of the US state of Texas, roughly, and it will have, if the projection's even remotely correct, it will have about 1 billion people. So I completely sympathize with the idea that farming is a huge, huge priority for this country. But I think this is and this has nothing to do with feelings about the Chinese in particular. The pressures on the land and sensitivity about land ownership and management will increase in proportion to the increase of the population. And so this has to be thought through, I think, very carefully.
Well, thank you very much, Howard. Now, a lot of issues that we still haven't talked into, but I hope in the conversation that opens up, we'll be able to discuss them. So I'm opening up the floor. I don't want a situation where people don't get a chance to engage. So, yeah. Wait. Oh, you can take. There's people's hands raised up, right there. Yes. The young man and then the young lady. Yeah, one. We'd take like 3, then come back to them, and then take another 3.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Timileni. I'm a political scientist with special interest in political economy. So my question is to the governor of Kaduna State. You said on a general level the presence of China in Africa and in Nigeria by extension is a good thing. But I'd like to draw your attention to the issue of human rights. Like you know, many of the factories where Nigerians work owned by Chinese, they treat the workers poorly. So I'd like to ask you, how do you think the Nigerian government can help in this regard? Because I think we've had instances where I think a pregnant woman was kicked by a Chinese employer and I think she lost her baby. So how do you think the government can work in that regard, human rights? Thank you.
Thank you. There's a young lady behind him. Yes, please.
Good afternoon. My name is Chinelo. My question is about this issue of arable land that was raised and the idea that Africa is just this vast place where all this arable land is just sort of waiting for the taking. And I was wondering where the discussions of climate change and the preservation of, for instance, old growth forests, which we are rapidly losing, issues of deforestation, which are actually leading to massive changes in the climate. Where do these things factor when we talk about investment and business and business interests?
Thank you. The lady in, okay, the gentleman in front first, hang on, with the black cap, yes, and then behind him, and then we'll come back to them.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I just want to see if I could task the 2 discussants. What I'm hearing, if I'm right, is Professor French sounds more to me like a pessimist who sees a bottle as being half empty, whilst Governor Rufai is seen as half full. One talks about opportunity for Africans to embrace, and another one sees Chinese as opportunism. Please correct me if I'm wrong. Thank you.
Okay, we'll take these comments first, and then we'll come back to you. Let's take the 3, and then we'll come back to the floor. Mr. Governor, do you want to start? Oh, okay, all right.
So I think I said that China is neither good nor bad, and I also said that it's good to have suitors, and it's good to have options. And I see China as an option that has shown up on the scene for African countries in general, again, in recent history for the first time after a long absence. In the abstract, I think that's absolutely good. Whether it becomes a good thing in reality or not is largely on Africans. Africans have to be serious about, and this is true about whether or not Westerners are good partners for Africa too. It's not about Chinese people. Whether or not you have good partners is largely has to do with how you manage your own business, how you manage your own.
Do you think in writing this book, you carry the burden of your nationality? Because you're American, there's suspicion that perhaps there is an agenda that you are pushing.
Well, so if I got too worried about that, I probably wouldn't write books, right? I trust that people who take the effort to read the book will come away understanding that that's not where I'm coming from. And I think I've just said much the same thing in response to the gentleman's question. I want to respond to the human rights question, if I could, very quickly while I have the microphone. Africans would do very well to understand the way China itself opened up to international investment and business in the early 1980s. It was very clear about the kinds of conditions it imposed on foreign companies coming in. China was very poor at the time. It was desperate to catch up, and it was desperate for capital. But it was not so desperate that it just lay down, and used this kind of vulgar Nigerian expression, "Money na hand, back na ground." It said, no, you want to come here, you have to satisfy very specific arrangements. For example, you cannot have majority ownership here. For example, you have to transfer skills, you have to transfer technology, there has to be transfer of the patent rights after a given time. The Chinese made sure And they did so by leveraging the size of their market, which is something Nigeria can do itself.
Now, can I quickly ask, in the course of researching this book, did you come across any African countries where the conditions, the labor conditions in Chinese factories, in places where China was doing business, could be considered, okay? Or was it all through a question of complaints about the way they treat the few that they employ?
No, so this became a political issue in Zambia, most prominently, because Zambia is a mining economy. Zambia has organized labor, a long history of organized labor. The Chinese came in. The Chinese don't have independent organized labor. They came in thinking, well, we signed a deal with the government. That means we can do what we want because the government agreed. And they ran into resistance from organized labor, which then translated into political movements, which then translated into Chinese labor practices becoming a frontline presidential election campaign issue in Zambia. And this kind of agitation from the bottom up forced the Chinese to adjust their practices to the point where now Chinese practices in Zambian mines are generally okay. But they don't come in offering to be generally okay. This is because the Zambians took care of that aspect of business.
Well, I would like to confess to Professor French, and I whispered that to him before we started, that I just bought his book today. I haven't read it. In the last 2 years, I've been busy with opposition, new political party elections. I used to read, a book a week when I was less busy, but now I just read files and documents and so on. My advice to anyone that thinks being governor is nice, don't run for governor. It's the toughest job in the world. You don't get to, you don't get to read, you don't have a life, so I have not read your book, but I intend to do so. He has mostly responded to the question of human rights. I think, as in most things, people do whatever they can get away with. So if Chinese companies are treating Nigerians badly in Nigeria, it is because some regulator in Nigeria is not doing his job. And I think it's up to us. As I said, engagement with nations and companies and indeed even individuals in a society depend on what you're able to negotiate, the rules of the game, and what you enforce. So do not blame the Chinese if they kick a woman and she loses her pregnancy. Blame the regulatory system that does not hold them to account. So it's up to us again, as political leaders. I want to assure you that we're thinking about that and we're not going to let it happen. Then the question about arable land and climate change. I have 3 comments to make. First, climate change is real. We can feel it, we can see it. Anyone that says there is no issue there is in denial. But I'm 55 years old. I don't worry a lot about it. I'll be quite dead by the time the ocean, the glaciers melt and so on and so forth. But beyond that, I also believe strongly in human ingenuity. I believe that technology and human ingenuity and innovation will address these problems of climate change, by the time I'm dead. So I don't worry too much about, my children, and so on. But what is important, and this is the third point, is as long as humanity exists, it must eat. So you will see forests giving way to urbanization, as well as agriculture. That is inevitable. My hope and prayer is that innovation in technology, not only in agriculture, mechanization and so on, will reduce the need for large expanses of land to produce, a kilogram or a ton of rice, for instance. And, what we have as arable land will be enough to feed humanity. But that is a problem for you. Maybe you are 20 years old, me, I'm 55, I'm already living on borrowed time, but I'm sure humanity will find a solution.
As someone in government, if I may, Mr. Governor, isn't your responsibility not just to the immediate, but to also look forward and set policies that are supposed to essentially build for your children and grandchildren
True,
as well.
true. It is our job to think sustainably, and we are. But I want to assure you that if you talk to any governor, we are thinking sustainably. We are thinking for the next 4 years, okay? Because that's the period in which we'll be held accountable for our actions. And we know that we must feed people. We have to get those that will think long term to plan long term. We are not ignoring that, but I'm just saying that today, Nigeria spends 70% of its dollar earnings on imports of food and fuel. Just these two items. And we all know we can produce both within the borders of this country with the right incentives, with the right environment. We would be able to produce enough food to avoid or to minimize imports. We don't have to produce fuel. We produce crude oil, export it, and import refined products. 70% of our foreign exchange outflows monthly go towards just these two items. We spend about $1 billion a month importing rice. Now, these are the issues that concern us today, and we have to solve them. And with our earnings going down, with crude oil prices going down, we have to find these solutions today before we think of what will happen when climate change affects us in 20 or 30 years. So it's a tricky situation we're in. We have to strike a balance between meeting immediate needs and then thinking of the future. But we are those of us that have to think about the long term are doing that, while those of us that have to address the short term needs of feeding our population today without imports, if we can, have to do that as well. I think Professor French has responded to your question about opportunities versus opportunism. I completely agree. I think that we must see every situation that faces us in a way that maximizes benefits to us. That's how I see it. I don't think Nigeria can afford not to relate with China or India or indeed any country in the world. But we must ensure that that relationship is such that, the benefits exceed the cost. Thank you.
Questions? Okay, let's come here, please. There's a gentleman in red, and then next to him someone in, I think it's blue. And then we'll come to the middle of the front, the front row, okay.
My name is Bisi Alimi, and my question goes back to what Professor French said about the fear of irrationality when it comes to China-African business engagement, and also what the governor said about the enthusiasm of trade arrangement with China. I sit on a World Bank board, and I know for sure that there is no trade engagement without conditionality. And it goes back to what the young man said about human rights, which in a broader term is bigger than a woman kicking, a Chinese kicking a woman that is pregnant, and going about how do we uphold the tenet of human rights within trade agreements that will not compromise the sovereignty and the status quo of a particular country that is engaging with a country that is economically, politically, and technologically more powerful than the country that is engaging with, whether we like it or not. The reality is Africa cannot stand shoulder to shoulder with China in trade agreement. And for that alone, China will dictate the condition for Africa. How do we safeguard against that?
Okay. Yeah. Let's take, yes, please. And then there was a lady in hijab. So we do the lady in front after him, and then the lady in hijab, and then we come back to the panel, yeah? Okay.
Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ayo Sogoro. I'm a writer. I'm also a lawyer. To what Governor Rufai said earlier about he trying to do the best he can do within the next 4 years, I quite agree with that premise. But the question is, a lot of the problems in Nigeria and with Africa generally has been about the government always continuously trying to mind business for the citizens. I mean, we have systems where a lot of power is concentrated in the hands of government. Instead of things to be freed up, they keep squeezing and regulating and tightening up areas for the people. So is it possible instead to approach the issue by pushing for a devolution of powers, a decentralization of government, and a proper liberalization of the economy, as opposed to always trying to regulate all of this through the government apparatus? Thanks.
Okay. Please, when you take the mic to ask your question, can you try and make it short? We've got like 10 minutes to go, so I want to give as many people a chance as possible.
Hello, my name is Ayodele Morocco Clark. My question is to the governor. I know you had said that you were busy, or most governors are busy, concentrating on what they're going to do for the next 4 years. While we do appreciate the fact that things to do with feeding the population is very important, I think one of the problems we have in Nigeria and in Africa generally is that there's been a failure on everyone's part to think of sustainable development and build it into whatever policies and plans they make. And when you're talking about like the debts and our falling earnings, what we have is they have been like overinflated contracts and things like that. What I want to know is, what are you doing, one, for your state, and probably in general to like help other governors or talk to them, or in your discussions monthly or anything, about like changing the business as usual way we operate in Nigeria and adopting something that would stand us in good stead, which of course bears in mind that Nigeria is a very, very fast-growing population, and we also have to do something to kind of curb the growth of the human population if we are going to survive on the longer term. Thank you.
Thank you. And then there's someone in yellow over there, and if I may say something while they're taking the mic to her, given that there's been a discussion about the impact of climate change in the northeastern part of Nigeria, where Boko Haram is very active, and desertification has meant that a lot of the young people that traditionally would farm, how do you sort of sit that in with your policy of we're going to focus on 4 years, even though we're worried about sustainability? And
my name is Mariam Ali. My question to the governor is that the Nigerian government is known for its drafting of fantastic policies on paper. We have so many of such fantastic policies in archives now gathering dust. So how are we sure that these policies we are going to enact with the Chinese is going to be put into practice and not just go the way of the others that we had in the past? Because that's the way we used to do things here in Nigeria. We draft fantastic policies, and that's where it begins and ends, nothing on ground. Thank you.
Okay, we'll take, the answer.
Okay, so there were many questions for the governor. I'll try to be really quick. The gentleman asked, how does Nigeria stand shoulder to shoulder with much more powerful foreign interlocutors? There are a couple of really simple answers to that, I think. They don't offer perfect solutions, but they offer a beginning of an approach. The most important thing happening that Nigeria is doing today has nothing to do with the government. Nigeria as a civilization, Nigeria as a collection of peoples, Nigeria as a cultural force is in the process of, if you will, recolonizing West Africa. I've spent a lot of my life in Francophone West Africa, places where you would never imagine Nigerian influence becoming big. Now, Nigerian influence is immense in all kinds of aspects of life, from popular culture to food to banking to what have you. The Nigerian government didn't do anything to make those things happen. This is just Nigerian energy itself. The Nigerian government could potentially become a catalyst to enhance this kind of thing and to engage with the rest of the region in a way that doesn't just boost Nigeria's own prestige and influence or power, but also enhances the power of the region as a whole. And in doing so, this allows theoretically, the region, the possibility to come together in dealing with foreign interlocutors, whether it is the Bretton Woods institutions or with the Chinese or with whoever, to say, listen, we're not going to negotiate a railway one country at a time with you. We're not going to negotiate a bunch of syndicated loans one country at a time with you. We're not going to negotiate whatever one country at a time with you. We're coming with some integrated plans with a much larger population base, with a much larger economy taken together as a group, so that we can obtain better terms and that we can have a more rational outcome. This is the way forward, I think.
Paradoxically, isn't this what you said basically happened in your book when it comes to the Chinese? So you've got a formal engagement that is taking place using states, Chinese structures, and then you've got a less informal engagement where Chinese people are literally saying, I want a better life, and I'm going to go out and sit in Africa and basically make that better life. Yeah?
Well, so the Chinese migration to Africa is by and large the result of individual initiative. The Chinese state has almost nothing to do with it in a direct sense. But the way China has engaged as a nation state with Africa is simply dealing with what it found on the ground. So a bunch of scattered, disparate states that don't coordinate among themselves. You have China, 1.3 billion people. You don't have to think Chinese people are evil or bad or ill-intentioned to understand that they're going to get the better part of they're going to get the best of the deal with you, because what is Togo compared to China? What is Zambia compared to China? In East Africa, they've just very belatedly realized that almost all of the countries have negotiated or begun to negotiate railway construction, very ambitious railway construction arrangements with China. And sort of midway into this effort, they said, why didn't we do this together? Why didn't we make sure the thing was integrated, that it's all the same gauge, that we have one package price, that it has one vision, that essentially, instead of some off-the-shelf plan that came from China, a vision that meets our needs as a region, not just as individual countries that will help the president get elected 4 years down the road, but something that has a sort of more staying power in terms of its logic. This is the way that Africa has to engage with China and with the rest of the world, all of the world.
Yes, I think the question on dictating terms of trade with China has been answered mostly by Professor French. The only thing I would like to add is the expansion of Nigeria's banks into African countries was not without the support of the Nigerian government. I was minister then when we took decisions to consolidate banks so that our banks are stronger, have much larger capital base, and we also negotiated in ECOWAS towards a common currency that enabled the licensing standards across central banks in the West Africa sub-region to be standardized, making it easier for Nigerian banks to operate. So it was not just Nigerian ingenuity. There were public policy initiatives that facilitated that. I know some of the stuff like the movies was purely Nigerian entrepreneurship, but some of this, even those the Nigerian government intervened in that sector with grants to support that. So it's not all accident. I would just want to add that before I go on to the next question.
The second part of that question is talking to the inevitability of the sort of David versus Goliath kind of relationship that is going to exist simply because they're bigger than us, they're richer than us.
Frankly, I don't see it that way. I think it depends on how you look at it. I think China needs Africa more than we need China. And the way the world economy is structured today, as I said, we have choices. We don't have to deal with China. We don't have to deal only with the US or Europe or India. There are choices. Whatever you want to do in this world today, you can actually bid the various countries and companies against each other and get the best deal. It all depends on how prepared you are and how clear-eyed you are about what you want. So I don't agree. China has no natural resources. They need our oil, they need our minerals. They need Africa more than we need them. But it depends on how we sit and leverage on our strengths and capitalize on their needs. I think, again, it's a question of quality of public policy and political leadership, which I'm happy to say in Nigeria today, we have much better leadership that will engage with China at that level than we've had before. Having 55 or so African countries agreeing to deal with China on similar levels, I think, may be desirable, but nearly impossible. Africa is not a country, it's 53. Even the sub-regions, just break it down, make it a little easier.